I'm Chelsea White of Chelsweets, and I'm here today to show you how to make this chocolate overload cake. So this cake is going to be really intense. It involves a lot of different types of chocolate, and it's going to be really delicious. So I'm going to go ahead and get started assembling my cake layers, and I'm going to zoom in so you guys can see exactly what I'm doing. So I'm going to begin by taking a little bit of chocolate ganache that I've made, and I'm just going to go ahead and put it onto my cake ground. And this is going to help secure our cake layers to our cake base. So I'm going to go ahead and nestle this onto my cake board. Get rid of my parchment paper as I'm doing this. And I'm going to be covering this with some chocolate ganache here. And chocolate ganache that I'm using is just cream and chocolate that I melted together. So I'm going to go ahead now and just spread it around with my offset spatula. And usually I like to cover my cake layers with an American buttercream, but since this is going to be a really rich and decadent cake, I wanted to mix it up a little bit, and that's why we're using ganache to put in between the layers and all around the cake. So this is going to taste really fudgy and delicious, and it kind of reminds me of like the fudgy bakery style icing that I grew up with. So that's what we're kind of trying to emulate today. So I'm going to go ahead and smooth this out with my offset spatula. And I'm also going to be adding some miniature chocolate chips between the layers. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of sprinkle these around my cake layer. And this is going to help give us a really great texture when we bite into this. And kind of surprise you when you bite into each little bit of cake. And also you guys, as I'm decorating, if you have any questions about baking or what I'm doing or anything else, feel free to ask them. So I'm going to go ahead now and add my second cake round. I'm using 7-inch cake rounds, and this is my very favorite chocolate layer cake recipe. And as you can see, it bakes really flat, which is great when you're working with ganache, because if you have to level your cake layers, sometimes you can get crumbs in your ganache as you're spreading it. So it's really nice to have flat layers that you don't have to worry about leveling. So if you guys are looking to try a new chocolate cake recipe, I highly recommend trying this one. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and spread this around as well. Any questions out there?
Do you like using small chocolate chips or large chocolate chips in the middle?
So for this, I really like using small chocolate chips just because it helps kind of distribute more evenly throughout the cake. But it's all about your preference, so if you really love large chocolate chunks, or you like regular sized chocolate chips, you can use that too. If you also really love white chocolate, you could use that as well. And the ganache that I'm using today, I've used milk chocolate to make, and I've used a ratio of 3:1, so 1 part heavy cream and 3 parts milk chocolate. So I'm going to go ahead now and add some more chocolate chips. And for anyone who's just tuning in, we're making a chocolate overload cake today, and the recipe for this entire cake and ganache can be found on Chelsweets.com. So next we're going to go ahead and add our last layer. This cake is only going to be 3 layers tall just because it's going to be really rich, so I didn't want to make it too high. We're going to go ahead and nestle this right there. And get rid of this parchment paper. And we're going to go ahead and press this down just to make sure that we get all of the ganache, any air bubbles that might be in between, out.
How do you make your layers so flat?
So the layers bake really flat just based on the recipe that I use. It's really fantastic, and it just has to do with the amount of leavening agents and liquid in the recipe. So I highly recommend trying it if you're looking for a chocolate cake recipe. So now I'm going to go ahead and just make sure that my layers are pretty evenly lined. And now we're going to go ahead and cover the cake in ganache. So I like to always add a lot of whatever I'm covering my cake in at the top and then kind of work it down the sides. There's a lot of different ways you can frost a cake, so if you guys have a different technique that works for you, that's great. But today I'm going to be doing it this way just because I think it's the easiest.
Could you also make this cake with other cake flavors?
Of course. It could be really fun if you did a strawberry cake base. You could do a ton of different things. So if you have a different flavor combination in mind that you want to try, or you just don't want this much chocolate in a cake, you could definitely mix it up. So I'm going to go ahead and smooth out the top first, and then I'm going to go ahead and start working on the sides. So once we've covered this cake, we're going to go ahead and top it with a lot of really fun, different chocolatey items. So the decoration on this is going to be really fun, and we're going to be able to get a little bit creative, so I'm really looking forward to that.
Why did you decide to make a chocolate overload cake?
Well, today my friend that is helping me live stream, Charlie, has a chocolate account herself called Life Through Chocolate, and so I just thought it'd be really appropriate to make a super intense chocolate cake since she's helping today. Any other questions?
How much ganache do you need to cover a cake?
So it really depends on what size of cake layers you're using, how much frosting or ganache you want to put in between each layer. It's a lot of different factors, and there's actually ganache guides online that help advise on that. So if you have any really specific questions, I would search ganache guide and you can actually find the perfect amount for what you're trying to do. So highly recommend doing that. So I'm going to go ahead and get out a little bit more of our ganache here just to spread around. And I'm using a grease-proof cardboard cake round, and that's really important because as you can see, we're getting chocolate on here. And if this isn't grease-proof, sometimes the chocolate can stain your cake round. So be really careful that when you're doing something like this, you have that kind of a cake round.
Do people are asking about wearing gloves while baking? You always wash your hands, right?
Yes, so this cake tonight, I'm making this in my apartment for me and my friend. So I'm just using my hands because it's easiest, and I always thoroughly wash my hands before I start baking. So usually I really like to perfectly smooth out my frosting, but to mix things up, tonight we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're just going to be adding on some fun swirls, and to do that we're just going to be using our offset spatula, just kind of making some fun patterns here. So if you want a perfectly smooth-sided cake, you could always use a cake bench. But we want this cake to have a little bit of texture and be a little bit more fun than that. So we're gonna just make it stick out a little bit like this. And you can do a lot of different patterns. You could do nice long strokes on the sides. There's a ton of different designs you could do. So feel free to get creative with this part.
If someone has a problem with their cake sticking to a pan, would you recommend using wax paper?
So I always like to line my pans with parchment paper that I cut out in circles. Then I also spray it with nonstick spray. So if you're having any trouble, I would recommend doing those things, and hopefully they'll help you not have any more issues with that.
Can you freeze a cake like this to eat later?
Yeah, you definitely can. However, I think everything always tastes best fresh, so if you don't have to, I would say just dive into it right away.
Someone mentioned Matilda. Have you?
So that is also part of the inspiration for this cake. I think that most people when they think of chocolate cake kind of envision that iconic cake from Matilda. So I would say that's also part of the inspiration for this. So I'm just going around now and making a bit more texture here, and I think that's pretty good. So again, if you wanted a perfectly smooth cake, you could always use a cake bench and spin it around and get nice smooth sides. You also could do some fun stripes this way or lines diagonally. Those are other options as well. So I'm gonna go ahead now and just make sure that our top is nice and aligned with the rest of the cake and do a little bit more here, and then we're gonna go ahead and get going on the top of the cake.
For someone that's never used ganache before, does it harden once it's put on the cake, or what's the texture like?
So it stays soft, but it will set. If you put it into the fridge, it will definitely firm up. It's not going to be as hard as just regular chocolate because you did mix it with the heavy cream, but it will definitely get firmer as you let it sit. So I'm going to go ahead now and just clean up my cake board with the edge of my bench scraper here. And then we're going to go ahead and get going on the top of the cake. And I'm just going to leave whatever the bench scraper doesn't pick up on the cake round, but if you had infinite time, I would recommend using a wet paper towel to go ahead and wipe off any excess. So we're going to scrape a little bit more, and then we're going to get to the really fun part of this, which is going to be the top. So now that we have our cake fully covered in ganache and we have a fun, really random pattern on here, we're going to go ahead and add some fun decorations to the top. So I'm going to take some chocolate buttercream that I put into a piping bag here, and I've cut off the tip to have about a 1 centimeter opening. And I'm going to go ahead and just pipe an arch, kind of like a semicircle onto this cake. And we're going to be making a semicircle of decoration. So I'm going to kind of build it up in the middle. And this is just going to help all of our decorations stay in place. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with a chocolate sandwich cookie here. And we're just going to go ahead and fill this in with all of our different treats. So whatever chocolate things you have on hand or whatever your favorite things are, I really love truffles, so I'm going to be adding a few different types of truffles onto here. So I'm adding a milk chocolate truffle, a dark chocolate truffle. I'm also going to be adding some chocolate drops here. And we're going to also be decorating the back because we want the cake to look great when it spins around, so we want to make sure it's pretty from all angles. So again, if you have a certain favorite thing that you love that's chocolate, or if you chose to decorate the inside maybe with strawberries or fruit, you could always add those elements onto the top of the cake too. I always like to decorate cakes so that you can tell what's on the inside based on what is on the outside of the cake, so it's always fun to keep that in mind. So one of my favorite chocolate treats is our chocolate covered coffee beans or espresso beans. So I'm going to be adding on some of those now as well. And we're just going to have fun with this and be placing these at random. If you are really big, you're really big on symmetry, you can always make it perfectly matched. But I kind of like making things a little bit random. I'm also going to start adding on some white chocolate chips here to give a little bit of color to the cake. And I like white chocolate, so I'm going to go ahead and start adding some of those. Are there any other questions out there?
How many people does a cake like this feed?
So since this cake is actually smaller than a lot of my other cakes, I would say this would probably comfortably feed 10 to 12. But again, it really depends on your crowd and how big of slices you're cutting. But I think if you're cutting standard size slices, I would say about 12 people. But they'd be really full after these slices of cake because they're going to be really rich and delicious. Alright, so I'm also going to now add some chunks of chocolate bar onto this. And this is just a special dark chocolate bar that I really enjoy. So keep adding bits around the back. And in a minute, we're going to start adding in all of our different elements that are going to give us some height. Because we always want a cake to be a little bit dramatic and to really make a statement. So I have here some chocolate-filled wafer swirls, I guess you could call them. I'm going to go ahead and insert these into the cake. And I'm going to put these at a few different angles. Really make sure those are nice and secure in there. And we're also going to be adding some of these chocolate sticks.
How do you keep your cakes moist?
So this cake recipe, it has buttermilk as the base, so it's naturally pretty moist. So I don't really usually use simple syrup with this cake recipe. Traditional sponge cakes, a lot of the time, people do like to add simple syrup. But with this cake recipe, it's not really necessary. So I just cover it in frosting and call it a day. Or in this case, I guess ganache. So I'm going to keep adding on some more chocolate malt balls to the back here. I'll spin it this way so you guys can see. And we'll add a cookie here. So we're just going to try to keep filling in until we've covered up most of the chocolate buttercream. So once you get to this stage, if you have any crushed cookies or anything that has a pretty small texture, you can always just sprinkle it over the top if you want to speed this part up. But I kind of like taking my time and really adding in by hand all of the different elements.
Where can people find the recipe?
So the recipe for this cake, for the ganache, the cake layers, everything is up on Chelsweets.com. So if you guys want to recreate this or are curious about any of the recipes that I have used today, you can head to Chelsweets.com and find that out. And it's Chelsweets just like my name that's tagged at the top of this live stream.
How did you pick out what toppings that you wanted to use?
So to be honest, I went to the grocery store and I got a little bit crazy and I just bought everything that I could find that was chocolate, which is pretty much all of just my favorite things that are related to chocolate. But again, you can really use whatever you like, whatever chocolate things are your favorite. If you have certain candy bars you really love, got some chocolate chips on the floor. You also could add strawberries. I think those would look really beautiful with this, or even fresh raspberries. So there's a lot of different things you could do. Go ahead and scrape off these extra bits of chocolate. So I'm going to add a few more to the back here, and then I think we're ready to cut into this. So this cake is going to be super rich because we've covered it in ganache for anyone that is just tuning in. And I cannot wait to cut into it and see all of those beautiful layers. So I'm just going to add a few more, and then we will go ahead and start cutting. Do one more sprinkle of mini chocolate chips. So also, if you're worried about having chocolate chips fall all over your floor like mine kind of just did, you can always place this in a baking pan and that would help catch any of the runoff decorations as you're decorating. Alright you guys, so now that we have all of our toppings on in a beautiful little semicircle, I think it's time to cut into this cake. So I'll do one more spin before we do, so you guys can see it in all of its glory. And now I'm going to go ahead and get out my massive knife and we're going to cut into this. So I'm going to come around on the other side so that you guys can see as I cut into it.
Do you have any cake cutting techniques?
Yes, so in a perfect world, well, number one, you always want to have a really nice sharp knife. And I have a really massive one because a lot of times we make really tall cakes. It's also really great to, I'm going to adjust this a little bit. It's always great to run your knife under hot water or stick it in a cup with hot water to help heat it up so it really slices through cleanly. I'm not doing that today just because I don't want to run the hot water while you guys are watching, But in general, I do that before I cut into cakes. So I'm going to go ahead and just cut right out of the center here. And we're just going to gently go down.
They say don't cut it.
We've got to taste test it, right? So, all right. And also, as you're doing this, you always just kind of want to cut as straight as you can. I'm definitely no cake cutting expert by any means, despite how many cakes I cut. One of these days, I'm going to get really good at it, I swear. So now I'm going to go ahead and just lift this up, and we're going to see that beautiful inside. So as you can see, we have our really great ganache between each layer with our mini chocolate chips. I'm going to go ahead and set this down before I drop it. And I'm going to scrape off some of that extra ganache from the cake board, clean it up a little bit, and then I'll give you guys another spin. So as you guys can see, we have the inside of our cake, we have all of our ganache covering it, and we have our beautiful decorations up top. So with that, you guys, I think that is the end of this live stream. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this, I live stream every Wednesday at 7:45 p.m., so you can tune in next week and see another great cake. If you want the recipe for everything that I made today, it's up on Chelsweets.com. And if you want to see more of my cake tutorials, you can also check out my YouTube channel, which is called Chelsweets Bakery. And last but not least, if you guys want to see any more of my cake creations, you can also follow me on Instagram at Chelsweets. So thanks so much for tuning in today, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this cake as much as I did, and hopefully I'll see you again next week. Have a great night.